Welcome to this DCED webinar on unlocking women's economic power with legal IDs. My name is Ella Duffy and I am with the DCED Secretariat where I'm the Assistant Coordinator. I work on issues to do with gender inclusion and women's economic empowerment. I'm joined today by Sophie Romana, who's the author of a forthcoming report, which will be out soon on this topic, and Lucia Hanmer, who's from the World Bank ID4D Development Unit. There's been a slight change to the lineup. We had Thea Anderson from Omidyar Network, who unfortunately is unwell today and couldn't join. But if anyone has any specific follow-up questions for her, she is very happy to receive those over email. So this important topic is being looked at by one of the DCED working groups who have organised this webinar today. The Business Environment Working Group is one of 6 working groups of the DCED, and they focus on business environment reform and how donor and development agencies can work better in that space. So DCED, the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development, overall is a group, a forum for people coming together, the staff of donor and development agencies, and sharing practical recommendations and practical knowledge around private sector development. So this webinar touches on the business environment and reforms angle, and also the gender angle, and looking at how women's economic empowerment goals can be accelerated by reforms. So we are also doing this event in collaboration with the World Bank Group's year-long initiative Accelerate Equality, which marks the 10-year anniversary of the World Development Report from 2012, which was on gender equality and development. So this initiative from the World Bank aims to acknowledge the progress made and challenges remaining to close gender gaps, and takes stock of and draws lessons from evidence, knowledge and experiences, and generating ideas to sort of further advance outcomes at scale. This webinar today will look at this issue of lack of legal ID, which is often an orphan issue and cited as a sort of foundational problem in women's economic empowerment, but it's a big challenge to solve. This would, legal ID unlocks other opportunities. Having registered populations is a benefit for many governments. Today, we'll be talking about foundational IDs, so national ID cards and passports, for example, rather than functional IDs, which maybe let you get a SIM card or a bank account. This is all towards this report that's forthcoming. So just instructions for participants before we get started. Please feel free to use the webinar chat box if you want to introduce yourselves, but please put questions in the question and answer box, which should be linked from the bottom of your screen, and then we can see the questions clearly. If you would like to speak out your question, please, feel free to. We can unmute you if you raise your hand in the Q&A section. So write questions in while we're hearing from our fantastic speakers today, or think about them and put them in at the end. So I will be handing over to Sophie Romana, and then we'll hear from Lucia. Sophie is at Alte Strategy, and she has been the author of this forthcoming report. She's a gender, women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion expert, and is passionate about designing solutions that provide systemic change and empower women. So she's a graduate from in law from La Sorbonne and Columbia Business School, and is a dual French-American citizen. And she will be presenting some findings today, including a little bit on the digital angle. All right, I'm going to hand over now to Sophie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ella. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to talk about this issue today with you and to present a few key findings from the work I've been doing for the past few months. When the DCED was looking for a consultant on this issue, I jumped at the opportunity because I have run so many projects and programs where the lack of ID was such a big obstacle for women entrepreneurs who wanted to register a business or just go about their daily business. So it was really quite a welcome project that I took on for the DCED, and I really enjoyed working on it for the past few months. As Ella said, the report is looking at how the lack of legal IDs is an obstacle to unlocking women's economic opportunities. So when we talk about foundational IDs, we talk about ID cards and passports. They're very different from what we call functional IDs, which are only limited in the type of services you can access with a functional ID. For instance, a driver's license only allows you to drive a car. A tax ID registration only allows you to pay your taxes. But a national ID can help you prove your identity, can help you access governmental services like health, education, and other services. So we're focusing on this in the report, and we're not looking at functional IDs, which have value, but tend to be adding an additional step without giving the full benefits of a foundational legal ID. In terms of women's economic empowerment, we're looking at three main domains of empowerment. The first one is, how can one run a business without an ID? And as I mentioned earlier, the capacity to register a business is really important, because the difference between formal and informal sectors in terms of reaching additional financial services, being enrolled in public and technical assistance program, or even being able to bid on public tenders is impeded when you remain in the informal sector. Finding a job which has better condition is also important to be able to do that in the formal sector. And we've also looked at land tenure and access. So these are the three things we looked at. Next slide, please. So there are many, many reasons why women don't have an ID. The number one reason is the cost. It is quite expensive to acquire an ID, both in terms of time and in terms of money. There's sometimes a lot of travel involved, especially when we think about women living in remote rural areas where there's no governmental service where she can actually apply for an ID. Sometimes she will need to make multiple visits because she comes for the first time and realizes that she doesn't have what we call a feeder document, such as a birth certificate or a marriage certificate that is needed to complete the process of obtaining an ID. That lack of documentation is really critical. And the most important document is having a birth certificate through a birth registration. Birth registration is not automatic, although UNICEF keeps track of it, and it's on a good track to becoming almost universal. Sometimes she doesn't even hold her own birth registration or birth certificate. Her husband may have it, her parents, or altogether she doesn't have it because she's moved from her original village and hasn't taken that really important paper with her. Other documents can be used. For instance, in some countries, affidavits are allowed. So two elders from a village can confirm that you are who you say you are. And the civil registration process, the civil registrar can accept that type of document. The other reason why women tend to not have an ID is because they don't necessarily know the benefits of having an ID. Sometimes they use someone else's ID in their household. They say, well, I can use my husband or my sister's ID to go and do the transaction or the process I want to do. There was a survey that showed that 70% of Afghan and 40% of Ethiopian without an ID, they don't need one. So to me, the two key main takeaways of this research is that on one hand, we have to make the system of obtaining an ID easier, faster, simpler, cheaper, but we also have to make the use case available and run the last mile and make sure that women who don't have an ID understand that the benefits that are attached with an ID for her, for them, but also for their child, because there is a transgenerational issue here that when women don't have an ID, their daughters in particular may not have one as well. Next slide, please. So by looking more in depth at how the lack of ID opens doors and unlocks economic opportunity. These are the 5 domains that, I mean, there's the 3 domains of entrepreneurship, formal employment and land access, and subdomains like financial inclusion and access to cell phone and internet who are becoming ubiquitous in terms of business management and business tools. So when you want to run a business, to register one, you need an ID. There's no way around. And it's really difficult to know how many women who are in the informal sector have a registered business under their husband's name. I've worked with many microfinance institutions in a lot of different countries, and the agent in charge of maintaining that relationship knows that the business that the woman runs is under her husband's name, but there's no data. There's no way of pulling that information out of the database. Once your business is registered, you have access to much better financial services. You can have access to better loans, better credit products, better technical assistance, insurance products. It's really, it unlocks a level of loans that you cannot have when you're in the informal system. Women who are in entrepreneurs in the informal system, when they don't have enough assets to show that they can borrow more, they're usually constrained by group loans. So they remain invisible entrepreneurs, and they're trapped into those group loans that help them at first, but they're not, they can't progress fast enough. They can't borrow the level of money, the level of credit they need to actually invest in their companies or activities and grow them. Bidding on public tenders is another way of increasing your business, and without a registration, without being a legitimate business, you cannot do that. And that's an important step, because one of the ways that we can improve women's economic empowerment is through procurement, and it's becoming a really interesting way to make sure that women participate in the economy. So for instance, public service can have quotas requiring that 50% of anything they source come from women-owned businesses. When those businesses are not registered, women are cut out of this important source of expansion for their businesses. Formal employment, quite, obviously is possible with an ID, and it leads to better income. Wages in the formal employment are higher than in informal. Also better protection and working conditions. One of the examples I looked at was how women use platforms to access better protected work. And there's the examples of these women in India, for instance, who are janitors, and they used to be janitors in the informal sector. And once they obtained an ID, they were able to have the same job, but transfer it to a platform that provided them with decent hours, in the sense that they were working from 8 to 5. They had uniforms. They had a telephone number they could call in case they were getting into trouble for some reason at their job site. Overall, better protections, better working hours, better pay. So it's not necessarily changing your job or having more opportunities, but it's also being able to perform your job in a much safer, better environment. And that's a big difference. The two additional, the land access issue is also a very critical one. About 32% of farmers are women in sub-Saharan Africa, and very few of them have land tenure. And that's a very complicated issue, because it is linked to the lack of systemic organization of land registries, for instance. It is also linked to the inheritance laws, where in many countries, women cannot inherit their husband's property. For instance, it reverts back to their husband's family. So if they become widows, they're left with no land. There's a very interesting system that's gaining ground called the social tenure model, which uses usage of the land and confirmation by neighbors and by community councils and by mobile pictures and all kinds of ground truthing services to confirm that a woman is not necessarily a woman, but in our case, a woman is using the land, is exploiting it, so that she can have a kind of de facto tenure. But that's one of the issues where we have the least information on how many women are left out of land tenure. So I think that's one of for me, the the areas that need more research and more understanding of how we can make it easier for women to register land and to make sure and have it securely for them and their children. I think maybe one of the promising area there would be the blockchain land registries, but I haven't seen a lot of progress on that area. The two other sub-issues are financial inclusion, of course, which is not a sub-issue, but it's linked to both entrepreneurship, formal employment, to all the other issues, and land access. When women have a legal ID, they can have their own bank account, and having their own bank account and control over their assets and resources is one of the key definitions of women's economic empowerment. They can have access to credit and financial services. They can start saving. They can also start preparing for their retirement. They can have access to insurance. And it is definitely one of the key SDG factors that we're tracking in terms of women's ownership of accounts. And I think the latest data from Findex show that there is progress, that women over 15 are increasing their ownership of account. But the biggest issue still for them to open an account is not necessarily the lack of ID, but the lack of funds. So another thing to be linked to the capacity to generate enough income securely to open an account. And it leads them also to mobile banking. And when we look at the data from what happened during the pandemic has been almost like a catalyst to accelerate the use of mobile banking and all kinds of digital services. But we also know that the gap is persisting around 8%. According to the GSMA latest report, women are 8% less likely than men to have a cell phone. They also use the internet less. So there's an effort there to be made using, in that case, functional IDs and not necessarily legal IDs. But having access to a cell phone is becoming a critical business tool because you can, again, have access to payment, to social media and digital marketing, and also to platform work, as I mentioned earlier. In some countries and more countries, the possibility to buy a SIM card to have your phone function is linked to having an ID. And in some cases, it's been even very problematic. I think it was in Tanzania where the government announced very briefly and quickly that if people didn't have their national identification ID linked to their SIM card, they would shut down the service. They reverted. They didn't do that in the end because it was just too disruptive to the whole economy and to the whole functioning of the country. But in some cases, those linkages between IDs and SIM card are beneficial or can be another obstacle. So we have to keep in mind that how is it impacting women in particular? Next slide. So in looking at this issue on the registration side and on the use case side, which I think are the two main categories of the two main takeaway from me, here are a few ideas of how we could improve women's access to legal ID and make it easier for them. So the law, and I think Lucia is going to give us an overview of that in her presentation. There's still a lot of legal statutes that are discriminatory and don't allow women to obtain a passport or a national ID the same way a man does. So, for instance, in some places, the name of the husband is required on the application, but when the husband applies for a passport, he doesn't need to mention his wife. So the trend is going towards more gender-neutral language in the law and in the regulation and in all the circulars at the registry level. Removing unnecessary steps. In some cases, civil register agents add additional steps that are not required by law. It's just a practice or what we may want to call a social norm that is constraining women's ability to get their passport or their ID. But there are examples of making sure that those steps are not being implemented. So, for instance, in Burkina Faso, a two-witness affidavit to confirm the identity at birth was first thought to help women get their ID, but then it turns out that once you leave your village, it will be very hard to obtain that document. In Benin, there's an administrative circular that removed the requirement for married women to provide a copy of their marriage certificate from applying for a passport. So Those two examples show how easy it is actually to remove those barriers, and how sometimes when we put in place a rule that would help women obtaining an ID by multiplying the number of feeder documents or the number of ways they can at their disposal to prove their identity, is actually hindering them. Make the process more gender sensitive. So one of the greatest examples is Pakistan, which has made great efforts to organize women-only hours in their center where women can register, with female agents, with translators and transcribers. There's a whole lot of little steps that are happening in the process that that make it uneasy for women to complete it. Being seen in public dealing with a male agent can be frowned upon or simply unacceptable or uncomfortable. Women also tend to have less experience dealing with officials and with government representatives, so they don't know how to go about it, and they need support, and they need to be shepherded basically through the process. Increase the number of places to register. In Papua New Guinea, there's one civil registration center for, I think, over 600 islands. So going to that registration center to register a birth or get a birth certificate is really difficult. But different other countries have increased the number of places where women can register, can get into the civil registry. Hospitals, maternities, schools. In some countries during vaccination campaigns, mother and child can be registered at the same time. We can increase also the mobility units using vans and mobile agents, or even mobilizing agents from the private sector networks like mobile network operators, mobile money agents, or in India, where the government mobilized shopkeepers also to help with the registration process. So there are multiple networks we can tap into to bring the registration process closer to women and minimize their transport and the time it takes for them to obtain it. And also, the last point is really to make the use case and incentives clear for women. And it's not in a sense, it's really showing them what benefits they could obtain when they have an ID. So it can be anything from, of course, health, education, and government services, but it can also be acquiring land and registering it. It can be registering your business. It can be financial independence by having your own bank account. And that goes through campaigns and using trustworthy networks that women like dealing with. So for instance, savings groups is a great place. It's a great network to leverage because there's a lot of trust in savings groups. And also women in savings groups tend to organize themselves around social goals. And some of them can be obtaining your birth certificates, your marriage certificates, or your ID, or even in some cases, as I've seen in Mali, your voter card. So to make sure they participated in the voting process. Next. In the report, besides looking at a global scoping and understanding where the barriers are and what are the good practices that have already been created and put in place to encourage women to acquire an ID, I've also looked at two case studies. The first one is on the digitization of IDs, and my friend and colleague Thea, who works with OMIDR Network, is an expert in this area, but sadly she can't speak today. So I will sub for her on this topic, but it's a really critical issue when we talk about IDs. And actually, I don't think we can talk about foundational IDs without talking about digitization process anymore. The second case study is on the particular issues pertaining to women when they become refugees. They face a host of problems proving their identity and confirming it in their host countries. But I encourage you to read that in the report. On the digitization of IDs, it's a huge promise because those systems can enroll a very large number of people rather quickly. the idea of bridging the gap of the 1 billion people who are still without an ID in the world today is really enticing and really promising. India is at the forefront of this effort with their the Aadhaar card. The latest data from October is about 1.3 billion citizens who have now a single unique ID in their hands. That includes biometric data that can identify them uniquely. Nigeria is in the process of doing that. And it's an interesting case because they've almost been a stop and go country. For instance, they had worked with MasterCard to link a legal ID with a debit card. And there was a not well received by the population who felt that their intimate details about who they were being monetized. So that was pared down. They also had the mandatory ID card for SIMs and issues like that. And also Nigeria launched the whole process saying that it was for national security purposes. So when you start combining national security purposes, digital IDs, private sector, and very sensitive data, biometric, these need to be carefully monitored and governed and made sure to be safely and securely processed, stored, and shared. And in some places, the countries that are starting those processes may not have the full legal framework that can reassure citizens that their very sensitive data is being secured and not shared with private sector or for nefarious IDs, or just being at the mercy of hackers, for instance. One of the keys of the digital ID system is that women don't usually participate in those systems because there are few women in STEM, especially in LICs and in emerging economies. They're not part of the design system, they're not part of the outreach campaigns, and they're very seldom part of the governance processes. And that's something that ought to be explored more, because that leaves women out of those processes, or they simply don't know what it's about and they don't trust them. And the last topic, and I hope Thea is with us and she can type in the chat and add on to what I'm saying, is again, the security of that very sensitive data. Biometric data is your iris, in Kenya, it's your earlobe as well, it's your fingerprint. How is it stored? How is it used? Who has access to it? How many times is it being, do you have to give it, and to whom? And so the more times you have to give it to obtain an ID or a functional ID, the more chances of hacking there exist. The good news is that there are multiple good design principles that are already in place. The World Bank has some. Women in Identity, who is a working group, also has some. So there, and Microsave also has a framework called Gotcha, the good, which is how to make those digital system more gender sensitive. So principles and guidelines exist. We don't need to create new ones, but we really do need to adopt them and use them when designing those digital systems. So it's going to be very interesting to see what's happening in the coming years with digital ID. Some countries are so super advanced in this area that they even have almost digital citizenships, like Estonia, for instance. The whole government is now in e-government. Citizens can access their government services from anywhere in the world. So it's a promise. It has risks, and I think it's a new frontier where women really need to get involved and make sure that those systems are well designed for them and that they encourage women's participation. The last thing I will say on biometric and data, women, I read in one of the reports I used in my research that in some countries, women appreciated signing or being identified with their fingerprint, because they said, my husband can take that away from me. It's really me. So there is also that aspect of understanding that biometric piece of data that you're giving to identify yourself is really you. It was really encouraging to see that it was a positive effect. It was a positive approach that they had. So I know it's a lot of information and on a very complicated topic, but I'm going to stop it here and hand it over to Lucia. And then I hope we're going to go into a conversation.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That was a really good overview, especially with lots of examples. These examples and case studies that that she was talking about are in the report. So I would really encourage you to read that if you're interested in learning more about any of them. On your last digital point about Estonia's digital systems, we actually had a speaker at a previous DCED webinar talking about this sort of digitalization of Estonian processes. So you can find that recording on our YouTube channel as well if you're interested in learning more about Estonia specifically. So I will now be handing over to Lucia Hanre, who is joining us today from the World Bank. She is a lead economist in gender and development, and she leads work on fragility, conflict, and violence. Most recently, she's been leading the gender dimensions of forced replacement research and work on gender for the Identity for Development initiative. So she was previously a senior economic advisor in the Chief Economists Unit at the UK Department for International Development. And she has degrees in economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and an MPhil in politics, sociology, and economics of development, and a PhD in economics as well from the University of Cambridge. So she is going to tell us more about the sort of legal side of this topic. So without further ado, over to you, Lucia.
Thank you very much, Ella, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody attending the seminar. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of a World Bank initiative, which is called ID for Development, and the approach there, and to spotlight in some work on legal barriers that women faced, picking up from a lot of the points that Sophie raised. So could we have the next slide, please? So the bank has a group called the Identification for Development group, which is a cross-sectoral initiative at the bank. And it works on three main pillars, which is, you can see on the slide, we do work on thought leadership and analytics, on global convening, and on country and regional actions. So the country and regional actions are typically projects with bank client countries on ID systems. The work connects and kind of builds on the different pillars. So if we look, Sophie mentioned the principles on the identification. This is now in its second phase, and now, I think over 30 organizations that work in this space have convened and come together to agree these principles on how you work on identification. So one of the two of the principles in the principles for ID focus on inclusion. So these principles have gender aspects to them, and so, for example, ensuring universal access for individuals free from discrimination, and removing barriers to access and use. As we've heard from Sophie, those are both inclusion principles which are very relevant for women. And gender gender discrimination, or lifting gender-based barriers, runs throughout the pillars of ID4D's work. So if we go on to the next slide now. The ID4D, under its knowledge pillar, has done a lot of work on building up a database to globally show how many people have access to IDs or don't in low income and other developing countries. So what we have found through, there's a survey that the bank conducts regularly, which is called the Global Findex, which is on financial inclusion. So using those data, we've gathered an idea or some evidence and data which shows the extent of the problem that is being faced globally. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see countries with the largest global gender gaps. So those show the gap between men and women having access to a legal ID. So Afghanistan is the largest gap with nearly 46% percentage point difference between men and women holding IDs, with only 50% of women holding IDs compared to over 90% of men. And if you go down the chart, you can see the gender gaps. On the left-hand side is the number of women that hold an ID according to data from the Global Findex compared to men. So what do we know about the drivers of this gap? If you look on the kind of left-hand side of the gap, you can see the individual predictors of ownership. So some of these are particularly rural, women living in rural areas, women living in lower income countries are more likely to have have less access to an ID than men. So actually on the left-hand side, what we're looking at is the individual levels of ownership, and that shows there, everything else being equal, women are 11% percentage points less likely to have an ID than a man. And if you go over to the right-hand side of the chart, if you're in the workforce, you're more likely to have an ID. If you're married, you're more likely to have an ID. And if you're older, you're more likely to have an ID. If you go to the left-hand side, then if you have primary education only, you're much less likely to have an ID. On average, we have 44% of women in low-income countries don't have an ID, compared with 28% of ID of men, and the gaps are most concentrated among low-income and rural women with less education. So these we're having some new data will come out with the next global with the data set from the 2021 Global Findex. So there will be an update on these data soon. So if we go to the next slide, if we look at gender and legal barriers to ID, some of which Sophie has mentioned, we did some work on this with ID4D, and we can see that in the feeder documents, in the foundational documents that you need in order to get your ID, the birth registration and certificate, there are gender-based barriers in that in several countries, mothers are unable to register the birth on their own, or they need a special documentation to register the birth. They need to show they're married. And in other countries, quite often, even if you can register the birth without the father's name, social stigma and not having a father's name on a birth certificate or a marriage certificate certificate will discourage women from registering a birth at all. And there are still several countries, there are examples there which are drawn from the World Bank's from another World Bank report, which looks at legal barriers, women, business and the law, which shows that in Barbados, Burundi, Fiji and Iran, so there the example is that the mother can only register the newborn if the father is dead. So there's only registration in exceptional circumstances. And for adult identification, Sophie covered some of these, but the main gaps which are gathered by our Women, Business and the Law database show that women are often asked to provide a marriage certificate when men are not. So this is an additional layer of bureaucracy, additional costs sometimes in terms of travel costs or costs to obtain the documents that are required from women. But there is the Women, Business and the Law report shows that tracks progress, and there is progress being made. And Sophie mentioned the example of Oman, which has changed legal registrations to removing the need for a husband's written consent to apply for a passport, and also now most recently removing the need for a woman to be accompanied by her husband when applying for a passport. And also in Cyprus, the civil registry removed a law which imposed additional requirements on married women and widows applying for a passport. So that we are seeing change and change in these areas, and we are seeing several countries adopt legal reforms and streamline registration processes so that women can, so lifting some of the burdens and barriers that women face when applying. So can we have the next slide, please? If I turn briefly to ID4D's research, we have done several studies which have examined barriers that women faced, gathered new data. This is an area where evidence is lacking. There's a lot of anecdote, but very little comprehensive evidence and data which can actually help convince policymakers to take the matter seriously and to design systems that are more inclusive to women. So the ID4D research has applied mixed method studies. So these are usually combining focus groups and very extensive qualitative work to supplement other administrative data, which look at both the gender gaps and the barriers for them. So we have some mixed method studies on Nigeria, Philippines, Rwanda, Ethiopia and Indonesia. And through these studies, we're building up a kind of picture of common barriers. Again, Sophie's covered many of these very well, but we are finding that a lack of information about how, and also importantly, why to register, what is the motivation for a woman to leave her home, incurs transport costs of getting documents, going back several times quite often in order to get an ID. What's the motivation? Why should she have one? Processes that require specific documents, particularly in low-income countries which don't have the institutions and systems that have issued them systematically to the population. And then social norms and constraints around household responsibilities play a big role. In rural areas, it's very common for women not to go a long way away from the home. They have childcare responsibilities, the responsibilities of maintaining, keeping the house, of cooking, of producing food, means that traveling long distances requires resources, both financial and help and support from others. These are sort of some factors that have come up across the number of studies that we've looked at. And in terms of solutions, when you ask groups how registration would be easier and what would lift barriers for women, particularly communications for women, delivered by trusted community leaders at the local level, both by women's groups and women's leaders, and importantly, religious leaders and local government officials or other people that generally deliver messages to the community. And then streamlined and flexible registration processes, in some areas having dedicated days for women, dedicated places or lines, flexible registration processes. And then again, sort of social norms, socialization, communications to men and women, so that men are also convinced of the need for women in their households, their wives, daughters, sisters, to have IDs. So bringing everyone along together. We're looking at some impact evaluations, which will provide more data and evidence on some of the issues Sophie was talking about. So how do biometric verification systems, what impact do they have on women's control over cash transfers, and also looking at the impact on inheritance and land in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh, looking at how does EKYC and together with female agents impact women's Vcash enrollment. So this is how, if you tweak the system, does this actually, what's the impact on lifting barriers to women's enrollment? And again, the global collection and data analysis, so, which we will have a new edition coming out in a few months, I think, for the 2022 data. So I think, no, okay. So if I go on to our goal, can we have the next slide? So in terms of looking at gender gaps, we are in ID4D. Our goal is really to understand more about the barriers causing the ID gender gap and to find solutions. And we can see if we, across our work that we've done so far, and we know from the work of working with others in this space that there are a number, the types of barriers can fall under four main areas: the legal barriers and policy barriers, the economic and procedural barriers. Again, Sophie talked quite a lot about these, but the requirements about moving in rural areas, transport, access to transport, the time it takes to get to the administration centre are particularly burdensome in many low-income country settings. The social norms and barriers. Then we, again, in Nigeria, we heard that gender norms influence the demand for IDs because many, both women and men, perceive that it's less relevant for a woman to have an ID. Sophie mentioned this in her own research as well. And then information and messaging and how to get messages to people. There was in Nigeria, the work there was a big gap between younger people would like to have SMSs or online campaigns, but older people were very much about face-to-face communications, communications from radio or from other means that were more familiar to them. So we are still working in this area. We're building up knowledge in it. We're very pleased to work with others and delighted that DCED is working here and has added to this knowledge base and is hosting this campaign. So also interested to hear from others who are working in this space. So reach out to ID4D if you want to hear more or want to find out possibilities of partnering on research. I think that's the final. Is that the final slide or next slide? Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lucia, for that presentation. I think it was a very good overview again of the sort of the legal side of things and the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. I think one of the key things I've taken away from both of your presentations is that this sort of use case needs to be, communicated more widely and communicated better. It can't just be sort of providing ID. There has to be a sort of the use case there as well. So I'd like to open the question and answer session of this webinar. Please do put your questions in the Q&A box. We'd love to hear from you if you have even comments or questions. The Q&A box is there for you.
Can I say something on the use case?
Yes,
Ella,
sure.
people, if I may. I think we need to be careful the way we phrase this, and I'm a culprit of this. It's not that women don't understand because they're not educated or because they don't have access to the information. It's more of a push issue in my opinion, that we, in terms of the governments, civil society organization, we don't make the effort to reach out to women and help them and give them the information they need. It's really hard to get information when you live in a rural area where you're illiterate, you don't have access to those networks, you don't know where to start with. And many times I hear the same thing, well, women don't know and they need to educate themselves. But it's really hard to put the onus on them. I think it's really the onus is on us. us who have who lead those systems to go to the last mile and make sure we put the information in their hands.
Thank you. Yeah, no, really, really good point on that sort of push side of things. I think maybe sort of leading on from that, I have a question that I can ask while we wait for our participants to offer any questions or comments that they may have. So thinking maybe on from that and the sort of practical things that policymakers can do to sort of make changes to overcome this challenge. Where do you think sort of low and middle income governments should start with this? So in your slides, both of you talk about various examples. It's in the report as well, things about rewording laws to make them gender neutral, or sort of adapting these registration processes to meet women's needs. So of all these sort of recommendations, what would you say is a key starting point, an opening to begin thinking about making the legal ID problem better, easier for women to get an ID? Maybe we go to Sophie first and then Lucia.
So I think the legal system is a big enabler or barrier itself. But I also think that it's not just the law, it's really the way we reach out to women. So for instance, even if you have a national campaign to encourage people to register and get their ID, those campaigns are not very successful if there's no coordination at the government level. So to me, the starting point is where the system is, right? So if it's a central registry, then the central registry has to be decentralized. The campaigns have to be done multiple times over 1 or 2 years. They have to be combined with other entry points. But overall, the system needs to adapt to make sure that low-income women in rural area are served, not just urban workers.
Thanks, Lucia. If you have any thoughts on this sort of legal side of things or on this question.
Yeah, I think it's important for the authorities in developing countries, governments, to actually understand how the legal systems come together, because it's quite fragmented in terms of it's different areas of the law and the regulations around registration and civil registration. So I think having a kind of scoping and a landscaping of the legal environment and regulatory environment, and also importantly how it's implemented, is a starting point before designing any ID system, and looking at that in a applying a gender lens to that landscape, and really zoning in on what the legal differences are, because I think sometimes it's just taken for granted that women need their marriage certificates for everything, and nobody sees it particularly as a problem and don't realize the implications. So having a scoping of the regulatory and legal environment, from a gender perspective, is very important. And what comes out of a lot of the work that the qualitative work that we've done, is one of the keys is really bringing the registration system closer to people. So the more ways and opportunities that you have to register, whether that's through mobile registration, whether it's through agents that come to the village or to the town, as in the case of Adar, whether that's going to a physical location, but having more varieties of locations and more opportunities which are closer to people's homes and where they are regularly lifts barriers for all the poor, but women in particular. So that is also, in addition to the points that Sophie's raised, hugely important, I think.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We have a question come in from Edward. It's sort of on the digital angle, which ties into something I was thinking of asking about as well. So I was thinking about sort of the opportunity presented by digital IDs. So if you said that in some cases they're preferred by women, in some of the case studies you've looked at, and Edward is sort of asking I find it hard to align the efforts and investments put in digitalization and education of rural girls. Is anyone working on the implications and the future picture of the digital divide and that sort of inequality? So I wonder if we can open up the discussion a little bit more on that digital angle and whether digital solutions, how much that's impacted by the sort of gendered access to digitalization, particularly in rural areas. Sophie, I see you're unmuted. Would you like to begin us here again?
I think there's a lot of people working on a gender digital divide. The GSMA reports on it every year now, and they put out really excellent data on how women access cell phones and use the mobile internet, which is critical. I think I don't know of any programs, or maybe somebody on who's listening to the webinar knows of programs that educate. I mean, I know of programs who help girls learn to code, for instance, and they're great incubators, I think in Nigeria and Kenya, where girls who are in school are learning to use technology and to code. And I think it's where it should start. The digital divide, that's where we're going to bridge it. It's educating kids and girls in particular, and increasing their presence in STEM. But to me, the issue around digital IDs is that, where is my data? What is my data? Have any campaign really explained to 1.3 billion people in India where their biometric data ends up? Who has access to it? What is data? Who knows what is data? So we take it for granted that because people use cell phones, they understand what technology is and does, and it's a very nebulous area, and that requires much more education than what we're doing. So to me, these are concerns. When women are not involved in creating those systems, or even low-income people, poor people are not involved in creating those systems, but they have to participate in them. So we need to increase those education and participation in those digital systems. But on the gender digital divide, there's a lot of work that's currently being done. Not enough, Edouard. I completely agree with you. There needs to be more. But I don't think the gender digital divide is ignored. Lucia, maybe you probably have.
Yes, I mean, as you say, that there is a lot of work being done on the gender digital divide, and more efforts to understand, the extent of it, who it impacts and why. I know that in the World Bank, getting services to people and information to people, this really the gender digital divide, or digital access to things, was really kind of highlighted by COVID, and the possibilities of using digital transfers, both in terms of cash transfers when countries had already had a civil register which had some way of reaching people with digital cash transfers. Then you could build on this during COVID, and so the kind of importance of it, and it being of digital access for basic services in delivery, was really kind of magnified during the COVID epidemic, which has sort of brought it more to the forefront of something that needs to be addressed, digital access in general. And also in some projects in agriculture, where services or information are being transferred digitally, then the emphasis has actually been on transferring cell phones, as well as the ability to access new services via the cell phones, because that women won't have their cell phones as well. So this has been something we've been talking about in the bank, is that, okay, if you have these projects, you have to actually provide some increased access to cell phones for women as well.
Oh yeah, let's give them cell phones. I could not agree more with you. We should not even...
rather than looking at the gap the whole time. So this is, so it is, development in policymakers across a number of policy areas. And of course, ID and having a cell phone and being able to use it, ID underpins all of this in most countries that we work in. So yes, hugely important area and a great point to raise.
I'm gonna, if I may, Ella, I want to share one story with you. I was in Senegal this summer and I was interviewing women traders in Dakar. And one of them, they're traders, they go from Senegal to China, to Turkey, to anywhere in the world, and they fill up containers and they ship them back home to sell. And one of them, she showed me a video of her on TikTok that had 1 million views. 1 million views. And she explains to me, she said, I put my video on TikTok, I received payment from the order on my mobile money account, and I have a driver and he delivers the order. So, and that's all pandemic related. They've changed their business model, but 1 million views. I was like, not, so let's not also underestimate how well and how much they know already, but there's gaps in their knowledge. So that's another, I think that this is my favorite story of 2022. It's the million views in Dakar.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. The global reach of TikTok. We have another question here from Karen. Edward, I hope that answered your question. If anyone would like to speak out their questions or add to it, please raise your hand and we can let you unmute yourself. Karen, I'm not sure if you do want to do that. If you do, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I can read out your question here. So this is from Karen Moore at Global Affairs Canada. Says, thanks for the useful presentations. In contexts where this is an issue, is there any evidence on the extent to which the corruption that sometimes acts as a barrier to accessing IDs disproportionately affects women? So I wonder if maybe we come to Lucia first on this one, if you have any thoughts.
I don't know of any evidence on this, and I'm not sure whether anybody is collecting evidence on specifically on this or not. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I know in the reverse how IDs can help women avoid corrupt practices from extortion. So which is not the same question, but just again with women traders and on the Uganda borders, between Uganda and Rwanda, women traders there was a lot of work on new customs posts and new customs facilities by a number of development partners and the government of Uganda. And one of the things that women reported, they work with some women's groups as well, in terms of knowing their rights trading across borders, was that having an ID made them official and less able to be extorted, as they weren't crossing illegally anymore. They could actually exercise their rights, felt that they could exercise their rights because they had an ID, they could cross illegally, they couldn't be extorted for extra payments in order for crossing, and were also less subject to gender-based violence and kind of sexual assaults as well. So that's so there's evidence the other way around, that having an ID prevents or acts as a barrier to corrupt and abusive practices, but I don't know whether there is or not. And I'd be interested if Karen is able to talk on this, whether she has any examples that kind of drive this question, because I must say I hadn't thought of it being something that could impact women disproportionately. So obviously corruption is a problem everywhere.
I think, Karen, I think it's more adding steps to the process because there are women that are not inscribed in circular or laws. That is more common, like making women jump through hoops, basically, if you will. So, for instance, the law says you don't need to show your marriage certificate to apply for an ID, but the civil register office is going to say, but you're a woman, I need to see your marriage certificate, that type of issues. So it's not financial corruption, but it's just additional steps that make the process more difficult for women. I think that's I have not seen, I'm like you, Lucia, I have not seen documentation of corruption, but additional steps, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, perhaps that's a good question to take forward as something that needs more research. Karen has just commented that she won't speak out today, but appreciates the answer. We've got one more question here. It's an anonymous question that says, very interesting conversation. So what is your reaction to the hashtag #WhyID effort, which questions the institutional structures that make a single formal ID a necessity? So they're saying that, so why do we think that this is the only way to identify people in developing countries, especially given all the barriers you have discussed today? Is there any thoughts in the context of maybe not having national ID necessarily in developed countries? That is the question here. Feel free, if you don't mind not remaining anonymous, to speak this out. Otherwise, I'll go first to Sophie.
So I think a national ID is useful because of all the benefits attached to a national ID, in the sense that it enables you to register your business, find formal work, travel abroad, etc., etc. To what extent should it be mandatory is a different question. And in so many cases, women find workarounds when they don't have a national ID, that I wouldn't want my message to be perceived as let's make it mandatory. I think, to me, the most important thing is really having an approach that encourages them to obtain an ID because of the benefits attached to them. But I think anytime you try to make something mandatory, it's really difficult, and it doesn't increase the trust people have in that system, by the way. It's rarely the case. So I just want to be clear that my message is not let's make it mandatory and we'll solve the problem, because we won't. It's really a question of making sure that that women have the information they need, can make those steps and the arrangements, and there are multiple level of arrangements, as Lucia and I have both said, that they need to make in order to gain this ID. But for me, it needs to serve a purpose for them. So there is any government would love to know the size of its population, its age, its health conditions. I mean, there's a lot of benefits for government to have a universal registry that works and to know who is in your population, right? That's undeniable. But there's a big difference with making it mandatory, and I will shy away from making it mandatory. I think we have to work with the private sector, the government systems, the civil society representative. It's a PPP partnership. Those three levels of institutions have to work hand in hand to reach the last mile and make sure that women have the information they need to obtain the ID that's gonna provide them benefits. So that's my own personal point of view. I will shy away from anything mandatory. Lucia.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think I mean the why an ID is fundamentally it's a way to claim your rights under the law in a country is the fundamental reason. Now, whether there are alternative ways to doing that other than a national ID, which would be as good, depend on the country and its legal system and what other institutions are in place. So I think, for many countries, the view, which is that some form of universal ID, national ID, is the kind of most straightforward and easy way to do that, rather than layers of different kinds of proofs of, I'm from the UK, so we don't have a national ID, but you have other kinds of proof that you can use to prove your identity in different circumstances and different choices of that. But I think the other important point is the principle around delinking ID from citizenship, which the best practice in ID systems do this, so that it actually gives an ID to anyone living in a particular place. So whether they're there because they've been displaced, or they're refugees, or because they've had to move move, that they still can actually have an ID for living in that country, which allows them to claim, again, to claim rights, to register for work, to get jobs. So I think it's, I mean, countries vary and have different institutions, different laws, different legal frameworks, and different systems. So everything is context specific, but in many places, having an ID is the easiest way to claim rights under the law and to afford protection to groups of people who would not otherwise be protected. So that's my view.
I agree with Lucia. I also think that there are multiple functional IDs these days. You know, your mobile phone is a functional, you know, because of the know your customer requirement. It is a form of ID because you've been verified. But when we multiply those functional IDs, we multiply the processes of getting the same information multiple times to different people instead of having one national ID that serves all those purposes. So I think the benefits of a national ID are enormous compared to the fragmented one of multiple functional IDs. So I would completely advocate to as Lucia said, that national IDs are kind of the gold standard. I love this idea also of delinking citizenship. I hadn't come across that. It's a really good one. So sorry, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. The idea of delinking citizenship is a really interesting one, and that, yeah, especially in the sort of context of forced displacement. The forthcoming report has a case study on sort of refugees, so that can relate in as well, which you'll be able to read about in the report. We've got no more questions coming in from the audience right now, and we're sort of nearing the end time for this webinar. So I wonder if I could just go to both of you for some closing remarks or key takeaways. What do you sort of see as sort of the most important maybe thing to research going forwards, or where do you see the gaps? Maybe particularly in the context of what donor and development agencies can do in this space. The DCED network is made up of mostly staff members from donor and development agencies and some private foundations. So if you maybe think about, maybe we can discuss exactly where they can best fit into this landscape as well. We can go to Lucia first. So.
Thank you, Ella. So I think this is an area where we need more evidence to understand both the extent to which there are gender gaps in ID, who particularly is impacted. At the moment, we're looking at gender, but we know very little about the kind of intersectionality of that impact. How we know something about how being rural impacts you, but in terms of gender identity, ethnicity, other kind of drivers of intersectionality, we know less about that and how to overcome those barriers as well. I think we could have more fine-tuning on. So there is a knowledge agenda. In terms of the links to impacts, I think we need a much bigger evidence base on what having an ID does, both in terms of empowerment issues of being able to claim rights or being able to act independently, and in terms of very concrete business outcomes or access to land. We need to know more about how this works, both to increase the motivation for IDs as a priority investment for development, as it cuts across both the private sector and public sector services. So more evidence on impact, I think, are in other areas. Yes, so I think, and then I guess more projects and programs that build ID or voter access to ID as into part of a larger program. So which could be across a number of sectors. So that's I'll stop there and hand over to Sophie.
Agreed on all all your points, Lucia. Thank you. There's one area that frustrated me in my research. I desperately tried to find some evidence of the impact of the lack of ID on unpaid care work and childcare. And if we think about, how access to childcare is critical to women's participation in the labor force and the economy, I'm just wondering if an ID doesn't help, because, of course you want to be identified as the mother of your child, right? And so I would love to look at this angle of unpaid care work, childcare, and links to ID, and does a legal ID help overcome those barriers in terms of women's economic participation? That was one of my gaps that I found. Land, as you mentioned, Lucia, is all the land tenure, land issues is we need so much more evidence and work, and the link there also between the legal frameworks around inheritance, access to land, nationality. It's a webbed issue when you start looking into women's access, tenure, usage, ownership of land. So more evidence and more gender data in that area. Yes, and I love your call to action that programs that work in women's economic empowerment or gender-based violence or anything to do with women and men, by the way, that one of our first steps would be, how can we help them get an ID? I completely subscribe to this.
Thank you. Some really interesting takeaways there around evidence and impact and data as well. Fantastic. We have just a couple of minutes left now, so I think unless there's any more comments from our audience, then we will begin to wrap up the webinar here. I want to thank both of you, Lucia and Sophie, for your preparation for this webinar, for your fantastic presentations and rich discussions here at the end. It's unfortunate that Thea Anderson from the Omidyar Network couldn't join us today. She had some more information on the sort of digital angle as well, but she's happy to be contacted afterwards, so you can reach out to DCED Secretariat on the email admin@enterprise-development.org if you would like to be connected with her. The digitalization of case study is also in this report that's forthcoming, so you'll be able to see more information there. The recording of this webinar will be shared online on our YouTube, and we'll circulate it in our emails and a newsletter as well. So check out our sort of social media and things for that in the future. So thank you so much for such rich presentations today, and thank you to our audience for joining. I wish you all a very good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Ella and Lucia and Jim. It was a pleasure being here today. Thank you so much.